Hello and welcome to TVB News. The U.S. Federal Reserve implemented its fourth consecutive 75 basis point interest rate hike on Wednesday. The move aims to tamp down soaring inflation, but has prompted fears that a U.S. recession could be imminent. Daniel Rao tells us more.
The U.S. Federal Reserve's move raised its key short-term rate to a range of 3.75% to 4%, its highest level in 15 years. It was the U.S. central bank's sixth rate hike this year, as it seeks to control inflation that is running at multi-decade highs. The streak has made mortgages and other consumer and business loans increasingly expensive. It has also prompted fears of a recession. However, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell said the central bank may decide to slow its aggressive interest rate increases. Still, he warned the Fed isn't even close to declaring victory in its fight to curb an inflation rate that is near four-decade highs and has shown few signs of stabilizing.
At some point, as I've said in the last two press conferences, it will become appropriate to slow the pace of increases as we approach the level of interest rates that will be sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to our 2% goal. There is significant uncertainty around that level of interest rates. Even so, we still have some ways to go.
Powell also hinted that the Fed could downshift to a 50 basis point increase at its next meeting in December. The comments that hikes may be slowed sent stock and bond prices higher and reduced Treasury yields, despite the fact that any measure to do so is yet to be confirmed. Daniel Rao, TVB News.
Following the Fed rate hike, Hong Kong raised its best rate for the second time in 2 months. That means homeowners are facing a heavier burden to pay for mortgages. Jackie Lin reports.
In September, numerous Hong Kong banks such as HSBC raised the best lending rate by 12.5 basis points, the first rate hike in 4 years. In just 2 months, major banks in the city increased the best lending rate again, this time by 25 basis points. Financial Secretary Paul Chan says further rate hikes in the U.S. could be in the offing.
Now the interest rate of the U.S. is at a high level for almost unseen for almost 4 decades. The U.S. inflation at the moment still stands at over 8%. Unemployment rate is still very low. So there is still a high chance that the U.S. will continue to raise interest.
At the latest rate to pay off a 30-year mortgage of $5 million, homebuyers have to fork out an extra $670 a month, or about $1,000, if the previous rate hike in September is factored in as well. In the third quarter this year, the number of negative equity cases in Hong Kong stands at 533. Paul Chan says that's not too high compared with more than 100,000 cases reported during the economic downturn between 1997 and 2003. Chan added there will be no relaxation of the tough measure to stabilize local property prices. Meanwhile, the finance chief warned of other economic headwinds.
Yes, the economic situation has been challenging. The GDP of Hong Kong for the third quarter was released. It was a drop by 4.5%. Given the interest rate environment, external demand would continue to be depressed, which will affect our export.
Still, Paul Chan pins hope on the reboot of travel between Hong Kong and the world to help the ailing economy. Thomas Yun, assistant professor of the Department of Economics and Finance at Xi'an University, says property prices tumbled nearly 10% over the past year. Yun says those who obtained a mortgage loan worth 90% or more of the property value face a higher risk of negative equity, but such cases are rare. He urged more caution among investors, adding the higher interest rates in savings and time deposits could also lead to capital outflow from the stock market. Jackie Lin, TVB News.
Health experts said today at least 30 soil samples collected from service reservoirs in Sham Shui Po tested positive for a bacterium that causes melioidosis, an infectious disease that can harm humans. But the source of transmission is still unclear. Christy Kahn has more.
So far this year, Hong Kong has reported 34 cases of melioidosis. That's a significant increase compared with the annual average infection tally of fewer than 10 cases over the past years. Most of the recent infections were found in Sham Shui Po. After inspecting the area, the Center for Health Protection said 32 of the 471 environmental samples collected in Sham Shui Po tested positive for a bacterium which causes melioidosis. Those samples were extracted from the soil in surface reservoirs in the area. Speaking at a press conference today, microbiologist Yun Kwok-yung said health authorities were unable to determine the source of transmission. But he said the city's drinking water is safe for consumption. Drinking water didn't test positive for the bacterium. Those positive samples were the soil samples, he said. He had another round of inspections with authorities at the surface reservoirs again this morning, noting that there were no cracks in the water pipes. But Yun didn't rule out other possible high-risk factors. He said authorities had collected environmental samples from the surface reservoirs air vents for further tests. He believes the rising infection tally of melioidosis may be related to global warming, as a warmer climate may lead to more bacteria in soil. Christy Khan, TVB News.
The city reported 5,245 COVID-19 cases today. That's over 530 cases more than yesterday. This as the government further loosened its epidemic control measures by removing restrictions on the opening and dine-in hours of the city's restaurants and bars. Timothy Lee tells us more.
Lovers of Hong Kong's once bustling nightlife can now rejoice as the opening hours of the city's restaurants and bars are no longer restricted. Establishments that quickly took advantage of the loosened measure include this Japanese bar in Mong Kok, which has extended its opening hours to as late as 4 a.m. A spokesperson for the bar said there were phone calls asking about its closing hours, adding that she is optimistic about the return of the city's midnight snack culture, which will help boost business. However, even with the new relaxations in place, patrons of Hong Kong's eateries will still have to abide by ongoing COVID restrictions, such as maximum seating of 12 people per table. Meanwhile, among the city's 5,254 most recent COVID cases, 4,829 were locally acquired infections, while imported cases rose to 8.4% of all infections over the past week. Among the new mutant variants, another 5 cases involving the BQ.1.1 subvariant were found.
We realize that there's been a decrease in the number of local cases, but there's been a slight increase in the number of imported cases. We will continue to monitor COVID situation around the world, including subvariant cases.
6 residents from 6 care homes for the elderly and disabled tested positive for the virus. 705 positive cases were reported by 441 schools. 10 more COVID patients died in the city's public hospitals, with the 5th wave claiming the lives of 10,215 people so far. In the meantime, the government announced that the BioNTech vaccine for toddlers ranging from 6 months to 5 years old will arrive by Friday at the earliest. Timothy Lee, TVB News.
Financial Secretary Paul Chan spoke today on the last day of the Global Financial Leaders Investment Summit in the city. That's despite testing positive on the COVID-19 PCR test he took at the airport upon his arrival from Saudi Arabia. He said he was not given any special treatment as health authorities classified him as a recovered case.
On arrival, I did a PCR test and then go home, and then went home. This test and go policy also applies to every Hong Kong citizen coming back from overseas. The health authority look at my PCR test result, take into consideration the details of my health declaration, also take into consideration the fact that I did not have any symptoms on arrival. They finally decide this is a case of recovery, similar to the other 400 cases that they have handled before. So the treatment that I have been given was the same as anyone.
After days of silence, Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro has called for his supporters to end protests across the country after his election loss to Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Since Lula's narrow win on Sunday, Bolsonaro's followers have protested, including truck blockades on highways and some calling for the military to step in. Truckers have maintained about 150 roadblocks across the country, despite the Supreme Court's orders to dismantle them. In his video statement, Bolsonaro told the protesters, "I know you're upset. I'm just as sad and upset as you are. But we have to keep our heads straight." On Wednesday, Bolsonaro supporters gathered at the Rio de Janeiro Army headquarters, demanding the military keep him in power. Bolsonaro lost to Lula in a tight contest, garnering 49.1% of the vote to his opponent's 50.9%. Welcome back to TVB News. Russia has agreed to rejoin a wartime agreement that allows Ukrainian grain and other commodities to be shipped to world markets. President Vladimir Putin said Moscow had received assurances that Ukraine would not use the humanitarian corridors to attack Russian forces. He warned that Russia reserves the right to withdraw again if Kyiv breaks its word.
Relief around the world after Russia said it would re-enter the deal brokered by the UN and Turkey to provide safe passage of Ukrainian grain ships out of the Black Sea. But for how long? The original Black Sea Grain Initiative agreement signed on July 22nd expires on November 19th. And some analysts say Russian President Vladimir Putin wants leverage ahead of the G20 summit in Indonesia from November 13th to 16th. For now, though, it's back to business for ships passing through the corridor thanks to mediating efforts from Turkey. On the Chicago Board of Trade, prices of commodities such as wheat, soybean, corn and rapeseed fell 6%, with exports targeting countries that need grain the most, such as Djibouti, Somalia and Sudan. Russia suspended its role in the deal days ago, blaming Ukraine for attacking its fleet in Sevastopol with drones. Kyiv denied the accusations. Moscow said it would resume inspections after Ukraine promised it would not attack Russian ships inside the safe corridor, a situation Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky finds ironic. After 8 months of Russia's so-called special operation, the Kremlin is demanding security guarantees from Ukraine, Zelensky said in his nightly address. Zelensky this week met European Commissioner for Energy Kadri Simpson in Kyiv. This as the capital and its surrounding areas struggle to provide power and water to residents because of Russia's strikes on key infrastructure. Zelensky assured Simpson that Ukraine would continue exporting electricity to Europe when calmer times return. In the southern Kherson region, Russia-installed authorities continue to evacuate residents ahead of an expected Ukraine offensive. In Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine firm Energoatom said the nuclear power plant has been disconnected from the power grid after shelling damaged high-voltage lines. It is now running on diesel generators. Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department said it has information indicating that North Korea is supplying Russia with a significant number of artillery shells for the war, as Moscow's own stockpile of weapons reportedly dwindle. Similar accusations were denied by Pyongyang in the past. Nazvi Karim, TVB News.
In the U.S., a man who killed 17 students and staff members at a Florida high school in 2018 has been sentenced to life in prison without parole. Nicholas Cruz, now 24, had earlier been spared the death penalty. He pleaded guilty last year to premeditated murder for the rampage. Before the sentence was handed down, harrowing testimony was read out by relatives of Cruz's victims. Many criticized a state law requirement that all 12 jurors have to be unanimous in order to impose the death penalty. Last month, the jury voted 9-3 to give Cruz a death sentence. Cruz had earlier been expelled from the school in Parkland, where he carried out the atrocity. Here at home, the observatory canceled all tropical cyclone warnings at 6:20 a.m. today as Nalgae moved further away from Hong Kong. Nalgae was closest to the city in the early hours of the morning when it was just 40 kilometers away from Hong Kong's shores. The observatory issued the number 8 gale or storm signal at 1:40 p.m. yesterday. The number 8 signal remained in force for 16 hours before being replaced with the strong wind signal number 3 at 5:20 this morning. An hour later, the observatory canceled all tropical cyclone warning signals and people went back to work as usual. Meanwhile, a 10-meter tall tree toppled in a Chaiwan outdoor parking lot, crashing onto a construction vehicle at around 9:30 this morning. No injuries were reported. The Legislative Council passed a bill to charge glass bottle suppliers 98 cents for every 1-liter bottle. The new charging scheme is set to take effect in the second quarter of next year. Starting at the beginning of next year, glass bottle manufacturers are required to register for the scheme. Registered suppliers have to submit a quarterly report to authorities and pay the container recycling levy for the bottles they distribute or consume in the city. Suppliers can apply for an exemption if they're able to implement their own recycling and reuse arrangements for the glass containers, and that they recover 80% of containers. However, an application for exemption will cost $9,250. Some lawmakers question the efficacy of the new scheme. That's the news. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.